inside of France, following the outbreak of the French Revolution, there was much terror and horror on the streets. Fighting broke out and civil war would plague the nation. But no one would have anticipated that the King and Queen of France would lose their heads on the guillotine execution device. This was a device that King Louis XVI even introduced to the nation himself. However, in the years following the executions of Marie Antoinette and King Louis, their bones and graves were disturbed from their original resting place, and in the case of the king's bones, very little was found. But the corpse and remains were incredibly decayed and had rotted significantly. This is the story of what was found when these corpses were disturbed. The trial of Louis XVI marked a turning point in modern history. Once considered God's anointed sovereign, the king was reduced to the status of citizen Louis Capet. During his trial by the National Convention, found guilty of high treason, he was sentenced to death by a narrow margin. On the morning of January 21st, 1793, Louis was taken to the Place de la Révolution, formerly Place Louis XV, and executed before a large, silent crowd. His final moments were recorded by various witnesses. After attempting to address the gathered citizens, declaring, "I die innocent of all the crimes imputed to me," his voice was drowned out by drum rolls, and moments later the guillotine's blade dropped. Blood spurted from the neck stump as executioners lifted his severed head for the crowd to see. And following the execution, Louis's body was treated with a strange mix of secrecy and procedural decorum. His remains were immediately taken to the nearby Madeleine Cemetery, located behind the Église de la Madeleine, where many of the Revolution's victims were buried. The Madeleine Cemetery was a modest and relatively obscure burial site at the time, bordered by a wall and used primarily for those guillotined at the Place de la Révolution. It was not a site of royal grandeur or religious significance. In fact, the haste and manner of Louis's burial emphasised his fall from the throne. There was no ornate coffin, no elaborate tomb, and no markers of his once sovereign station. According to contemporary accounts, the king's body was placed in a simple wooden coffin, barely more than a crude box. The head was placed between his legs in the coffin, as was customary after decapitations, and the coffin was then taken the short distance to the Madeleine Cemetery and buried in a pit filled with quicklime to accelerate decomposition. The use of quicklime was both a hygienic measure and a symbolic act, intended to erase the physical legacy of the king and prevent the site from becoming a royalist shrine. However, despite the revolutionary favour, the precise location and the grave was remembered. A local parish official, a monarchist sympathiser, marked the spot in secret. His quiet act of memorialisation would prove vital decades later. Following the defeat of Napoleon and the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in 1814, the surviving members of the royal family sought to restore dignity to their executed relatives. King Louis XVIII, the younger brother of Louis XVI, initiated a campaign to locate the bodies of both Louis XVI and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette. In early 1815, official permission was granted to exhume the remains of the Madeleine Cemetery. Delesclos, who had maintained a secret record of the burial locations for over 2 decades, guided the officials to the approximate graves of both Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Though the Madeleine Cemetery had been closed since 1794 and partially built over, the memory of the graves had not been lost. On January 18th, 1815, the exhumation began under the supervision of the Count de la Pradelle and a commission of royal officials. What they uncovered was a gruesome and fragmented glimpse into the aftermath of revolution and the ravages of time. The grave, identified as that of Louis XVI, was exhumed first. The coffin, having been hastily constructed and buried in lime, had almost entirely disintegrated. The quicklime intended to hasten decomposition had indeed done that, but so inconsistently Parts of the body had decayed entirely into bone, while other remnants of tissue and clothing lingered in the soil. Observers noted that a blackened human skull was found, along with fragments of bone, particularly leg and rib bones, and decaying fabric, likely from the clothes Louis wore at his execution. A small remnant of white shirt material, possibly stained with dried blood, was recovered. Most notably, a jawbone with worn molars were used to help identify the body, as it was known that Louis had suffered from dental issues. Despite the destruction caused by Lyme and the passage of 22 years, the arrangement of the bones and the location of the burial matched Delaclos' records. The committee concluded with confidence that these were the remains of King Louis XVI. It was not a complete skeleton, and certainly not a body preserved in any recognisably human form. The remains were partially liquefied in places and soaked into the surrounding soil. The stench was reportedly overwhelming. No flesh remained. The torso and limbs had disarticulated, and the spine had collapsed. The decaying corpse was more accurately described as mortal residue. The grim physical reality stood in contrast to the reverence with which the remains were treated during exhumation. The bones were carefully collected and wrapped in white linen, blessed by clergy, and later placed into a new royal coffin. The identification of the king's remains relied heavily on the testimony of Delaclos and the physical layout of the cemetery. Although there was no DNA technology at the time, the combination of circumstantial evidence and the skeletal characteristics, such as the dental wear, persuaded the authorities and the royal family that the correct body had been located. There was also the notable absence of any other burials in the exact section of the cemetery where Delaclos indicated the king had been interred. Revolutionary authorities had reserved that plot for particularly high-profile executions, lending further credence to the claim. Nevertheless, some critics have questioned the accuracy of the identification over the centuries. The revolution produced countless victims, many of whom were buried without ceremony or record. But no serious alternative theory has ever gained traction, and modern scholars generally accept the identification as accurate, if somewhat imprecise. Following the exhumation, the remains of Louis XVI were taken to the royal necropolis of the Basilica of St. Denis, just outside of Paris. There, on January 21st, 1815, exactly 22 years to the day after his execution, the king was buried in a solemn ceremony. The remains of Marie Antoinette, exhumed in a similarly decayed condition, were interred beside him. Their new tombs were constructed with reverence, marked by simple but dignified monuments. The Latin inscriptions on the tombs commemorate their martyrdom and restoration to royal dignity. The decaying remains of Louis XVI became a symbol of both the horror and the sanctification of the past. To royalists, the exhumation was an act of redemption, bringing dignity back to a murdered monarch and re-establishing this continuity of divine rule. The decay of the corpses served to emphasize the suffering he had endured and his transformation into a martyr for the monarchy. An interesting postscript to the story involves relics said to have been taken from the scene to the execution. Some monarchist supporters were reported to have collected soil and blood from the Place de la Revolution. In one case, a handkerchief soaked in Louis's blood was said to have been preserved and kept by monarchist families for generations. More curiously, there were rumours that the king's heart had been secretly removed after his death, where, unverified, these stories reflect the deeply emotional response of some royalists to the king's martyrdom. In an age when the physical body of a monarch was believed to hold divine or national significance, even his bodily fluids or organs could become subjects of veneration. The exhumation of King Louis XVI's decaying corpse in 1815 was a dramatic and symbolic moment in French history. The body of the executed monarch, fragmented, partially dissolved, and buried in obscurity, had survived the very revolution that sought to obliterate him. Through time and lime had reduced him to a macabre collection of bones and rotted cloth, his reburial in the royal crypt of St. Denis represented the resilience of royal memory. His corpse, like his monarchy, had decayed, but it had not vanished. The retrieval and reinterment of his remains underscored France's complex relationship with its past, the tension between monarchy and republic, memory and oblivion, reverence and rejection. In death, Louis XVI became more than a king. He became a symbol of a France divided by its history and struggling to reconcile with its revolutionary ghosts. Marie Antoinette's execution followed the September 1793 trial by the Revolutionary Tribunal, where she was charged with depleting the treasury, conspiring with Austria, and worst of all in the eyes of the mob, being a symbol of the Ancien regime. Her once gilded world had already collapsed when King Louis XVI, her husband, was executed 9 months earlier, in the January of 1793. Imprisoned in the conciergerie, separated from her children, subjected to humiliation and deprivation, she became a figure of silent suffering. On the morning of her execution, she was led from her cell and placed in a tumbril, the same type of open wooden cart that had carried her husband to his death. Her hands bound behind her back, she sat upright as she was paraded through the streets. The guillotine awaited her in what is now the Place de la Concorde. Eyewitnesses reported her dignity and composure. A minor incident as she stepped on the executioner's foot elicited her final words, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." A moment later, the blade fell. The body of the Queen of France, once adorned in diamonds and lace, was lifeless, stripped and disposed of with little more care than refuse. The Madeleine Cemetery was a modest burial ground associated with the nearby church of the Madeleine in central Paris. It had become the preferred destination for victims of the guillotine during the height of the Terror. The cemetery had no grand tomb, no engraved stones, just long, deep trenches where dozens of decapitated bodies were thrown each day and covered with quicklime to hasten decomposition and to prevent disease. Louis XVI's body had already been deposited there in January. Marie Antoinette was buried near her husband, along with other guillotine victims such as Charlotte Corday, Madame de Barry, and the Girondins. Contemporaries noted that quicklime was liberally poured over the corpses, a common practice during mass executions. It served to reduce the smell and to prevent the bodies from being exhumed by royalists or sympathisers who might seek relics or attempt reburial. As time passed, the cemetery became neglected, and by the early 19th century, few remembered precisely where the bodies lay. The cemetery was closed in 1794 and later sold for development. Trees were planted, the graves were forgotten. With the fall of Napoleon and the Bourbon Restoration in 1814, the monarchy was re-established under Louis XVIII, the younger brother of Louis XVI, keen to restore the dignity and sanctity of the royal family. Louis XVIII ordered that the remains of his brother and Marie Antoinette be recovered and interred at the royal necropolis of the Basilica of Saint Denis. By 1815, investigations began to identify the exact location of their burial within the former Madeleine Cemetery, which was now part of the private property of the Comte de Crillon. Several people who had been involved in the executions or burials, including former guards and gravediggers, were interviewed to triangulate the burial spot. On January 18, 1815, digging commenced under royal supervision. The operation was meticulous but primitive by modern archaeological standards. After some days, the searchers uncovered a layer of decayed organic matter, remnants of clothing, bones, and quicklime. Among the remains discovered were 2 sets of skeletal fragments believed to have belonged to Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The identification was based not on DNA or forensic science, which did not yet exist, but rather on circumstantial and anatomical evidence. Marie Antoinette's body had suffered greatly. The quicklime had done its work, most of the soft tissue was gone, and the skeletal elements had partially disintegrated. The skull was fragmented and parts of the lower jaw were missing. However, there were enough anatomical markers to suggest it had once belonged to a female of around 38 years, the age of the Queen at her death. Tattered remnants of clothing and a garter were found, possibly remnants of the simple white gown she wore to the scaffold. Some eyewitnesses attested that her body had been buried with no coffin, wrapped in a coarse cloth. Tiny bone fragments and collapsed vertebrae were catalogued, and the remains were separated from other skeletons in the trench. The bone density, placement, and proximity to where Louis XVI's body had been buried all added circumstantial support to the identification. Notably, the remains of the decapitated head were in poor condition. The skull had been fractured post-mortem, likely during burial, or under the weight of earth and quicklime. The once beautiful face of France's queen had been reduced to bone dust, collapsed sockets, and a broken jaw. It was a stark image of impermanence. With as much certainty as could be mustered, the remains were declared authentic by royal commission. On January 21st, 1815, 22 years to the day after Louis XVI's execution, the bones were placed in lead-lined coffins and ceremoniously transported through Paris. The funeral was a spectacle of mourning and monarchical rebirth. Black-draped horses pulled hearses through the streets. Crowds gathered to watch as the procession passed. The coffins were interred in the royal necropolis of the Basilica of St. Denis, north of Paris, where generations of French monarchs had been laid to rest. A new white marble monument was erected for Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette inside of the Basilica. The sarcophagi bear neoclassical statues of the pair in prayer, an idealized contrast to the grisly state of their corpses decades earlier. The discovery of Marie Antoinette's decaying body was not only a moment of historical recovery, but one of intense symbolism. It marked the closing